Well, I'll tell you that I'm a third generation Singaporean. That means I was born in Singapore, father, grandfather from there. I had a very wonderful childhood growing up there. We were comfortably off, and I had lots of friends of different nationalities. When I say nationalities, I mean the ancestors came from different countries, such as China and Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. Although my features may look Indian and I have a name that sounds Indian, unfortunately I don't speak any Indian languages, although I really wish I could speak some, especially Marathi, because that's the native tongue of my spiritual teacher. I went to a Christian preschool, so when I was 3 years old, I went to St. Paul's Church School, where I learnt a lot of interesting things. The teachers were all from England. And after that, I went to a school called ACS. If any of you have watched the movie Crazy Rich Asians, you would have known that the rich boys there and the rich girls there went to ACS. When I went to ACS, no girls were allowed. It was an entirely boys-only school. And I got in there partly because they look at your intelligence level by interviewing you before you go to first grade, and also partly because my father went there and his father before him. So we were 3 generations of ACS students. And eventually, when I decided to continue in high school, my father felt that an English education was the best, so I went to a boarding school in England. So in my boarding school in England, there were students from various countries, and because I was born and brought up in Singapore, I felt more comfortable with those students who spoke English and who were fluent in English, which meant most of my friends were English, and also those who looked like their ancestors came from China. Remember, I was a young guy, and we all tend to approach people that look like the friends we had when we were young. So I unfortunately did not get to mix with too many of those who came from India or other Asian countries. And eventually I decided to go on to university to study aeronautical engineering. Before I went to university, in boarding school, I made some very close friends, and we enjoyed the same kind of music, the same kind of poetry, and had similar interests. Especially, many of us felt that the world needed to be changed so that the weaker and the poorer among us could have a better life. And I remember as a young person, I felt that the ultimate aim was for every human being to have enough food, shelter, and clothing. At university, I used to find some of the lectures really exciting. Some of the advanced physics lectures which made you think about the nature of the world, the universe, whether there was a creation or not. And of course aerodynamics, which was my favorite, about the flow of air over airplanes and into engines. But throughout that, the seeking that I had first felt at the age of 14 was still there. So in between my studies, I would be devouring books on meditation, on enlightenment, and on various philosophies. So the main thing driving me really was to get my enlightenment. And my aim, even before coming to university, was to go and find a real, genuine guru, a spiritual teacher, somewhere in the Himalayas, I thought, who would take me on as his student and help me attain enlightenment. Unfortunately, my parents felt that was not a very good idea, and they used a lot of emotional pressure to get me to at least go to university, complete my studies, and they promised that after I graduated, they would let me wander off to India if I still felt that way and find this guru. Now, during my reading phase, I came across a book by a person called Krishnamurti. And as you probably, many of you who have been seeking, find that when you're interested in something, those types of books tend to pop up. And I found out that he ran a school, or had a school, in England, where students were taught to live in a special way, in a spiritual way, and where all the regular subjects were taught. So I got in touch with them and got to speak with the principal and was invited to come and spend a few days there. So I got there, a place called Brockwood Park in the south of England. I met with the principal and we chatted, and she said, when you graduate, we'll be happy to have you here to teach physics and mathematics. And I was quite excited. And of course I'd gone there to also meet Krishnamurti, and there was a part of me that thought perhaps I would experience some of the silent witnessing he talks about in his many books. Before I met him, I met a student there from America who was almost 20, and he was from a very wealthy family, I found out. And at that time, because I had long hair and a beard, and I was speaking in a very philosophical manner, this young man said, come back with me to America and you'll be driving a Rolls-Royce within a year. And of course I took it as a joke, but it was then when I first realized that there were a lot of people in this country, in America, pretending to be spiritual masters. Eventually I got to meet the head of the physics department, and we talked, and he was also a seeker. He came to that college because he was really seeking, and he felt that that was a stage along his journey. Later the first day, I did meet Krishnamurti, and when he spoke, it was interesting like his books. But when I got up and we shook hands, I didn't get that excitement I expected. In fact, he started telling the physics department head that he was having severe back pain and may have to go for surgery. I stayed there for a couple more days. I met the students, lovely people. I met the teachers, wonderful people who had been seeking enlightenment or the meaning of life, or looking for something more than the materialistic world they lived in. And I got to visit a beautiful area of that school called the Garden. And the garden reminded me of the Garden of Eden, because it had wonderful trees that they had brought from many parts of the world. There were flowers, there were butterflies, there were birds. And for a young person who had been looking for something peaceful, enlightening, and wonderful, this was truly a Garden of Eden for me. Something interesting happened to me in 1976. So it was a period just before my exams, and I should have been studying hard, but I was doing my usual activity, which was either going to the nearby forest, which was Charnwood Forest, or walking on the university grounds, which were quite beautiful. And I usually sat in a tree, on a branch, lay on a branch, or sat at the foot of a tree, and sat quietly doing what I thought was meditation. On this particular day, which I did not know was significant until a year later, the date was the 5th of May, 1976. I was laying on a branch, and I don't know how long I was there, but eventually I noticed that the sun was beginning to set. So I got down from the tree and I started walking across this large field. And all of a sudden, I felt an intense rush up my back. Now this happened very quickly, instantaneously, but yet the memory of it is like it happened in slow motion. So there was this rush up my back, and something burst out of the top of my head, and I went into a state of pure joy, and I was bubbling with this happiness, and it just burst out, and I was laughing like a little child, and I began to literally float across the field towards the sun, which was setting in the distance. So this experience lasted for the rest of the evening and into the night. And I can tell you it was so wonderful. And the next morning when I woke up, the memory of that just brought back some of those wonderful, joyful moments. A year later, the following year, in 1977, I met my spiritual teacher, the one I had been looking for in my search for enlightenment, and found out from her that she had given me what Srimati Nirmala Devi, my teacher, called enlightenment. She had given me enlightenment by remote control. So that was the experience that I had, which I have to say for me did not mean the enlightenment I was looking for, because that enlightenment is actually a state where you are no longer the mind, you are no longer the body, you are no longer the emotions, and more than that, you have merged with the universe. You have become one with all of creation, and you're no longer something separate. And that was the enlightenment I was seeking. And Srimati Nirmala Devi, my spiritual teacher, awakened that in me barely 6 months after I met her.